On February 4, 1980, firefighters pulled a charred body from the smoking ruins of Studio 54's basement VIP lounge. The corpse was so badly burned that dental records were needed for identification. It was Jimmy Castellano, the 32-year-old nightclub promoter who'd helped make Studio 54 the most infamous disco in America. Police ruled it an accident, a drunk man trapped in a fire. But 43 years later, a single photograph would prove it was murder. Jimmy Castellano wasn't his real name. It was James Castellano, born in Brooklyn to Maria and Vincent Castellano on March 15, 1947. But in the glittering darkness of Manhattan's nightlife, everyone knew him as Jimmy Castellano, and the name fit him perfectly. He had this incredible ability to make you feel like the most important person in the room, even when that room was packed with celebrities and millionaires. At 32, Jimmy stood 5'8", with jet black hair he slicked back with enough product to stock a pharmacy. He wore custom-tailored suits, always black or midnight blue with silk shirts unbuttoned, just enough to show the gold St. Christopher medal his mother had given him for his confirmation. Maria still called him every Sunday at exactly noon, and no matter how late he'd been out the night before, Jimmy always answered. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side with his girlfriend, Diane Moretti, a 28-year-old aspiring actress who'd moved from Ohio 3 years earlier. Diane would later tell investigators that Jimmy had 2 sides the smooth operator, who could get anyone past the velvet rope at Studio 54, and the anxious insomniac who'd pace their apartment at 4 a.m., chain-smoking Marlboros and scribbling names and numbers in a leather notebook he kept locked in their bedroom safe, the same leather notebook that would later prove his death was no accident. By 1980, Jimmy had been working at Studio 54 for 3 years, and so naturally, he'd become one of the most powerful gatekeepers in New York nightlife. Studio 54 wasn't just a disco. It was the disco. The place where Bianca Jagger rode in on a white horse, where Andy Warhol held court in the balcony, where politicians mixed with porn stars and everyone pretended not to notice the cocaine being snorted off silver platters in the basement VIP rooms. And Jimmy controlled access to all of it. He decided who got past the velvet rope, who got invited to the basement, who got introduced to whom. The bartender said he had a photographic memory for faces and could remember not just names but birthdays, anniversaries, favorite drinks. He'd send champagne to tables with handwritten notes. Happy 6 months in the city, beautiful. Welcome to the family. J.C. But by January 1980, something had changed. Diane noticed at first Jimmy was jumpier, constantly checking the locks on their apartment door. He'd installed a new deadbolt without telling her. He started carrying his leather notebook everywhere, even to the bathroom, and for the first time since they'd been together, he'd missed his mother's Sunday call. Therefore, on February 3rd, the night before the fire, Jimmy told Diane he had to work late. He kissed her goodbye at 9 p.m., straightened his tie in their hallway mirror, and promised he'd be home by 4 a.m. at the latest. She'd never see him alive again. The call came in to the FDNY at 4:47 a.m. On February 4th, smoke pouring from the basement of the building at 254 West 54th Street. The first responders knew the address immediately. Everyone knew Studio 54. But when firefighters descended into the basement, something was wrong. The fire was contained entirely to the VIP lounge, a 600-square-foot room accessed through an unmarked door behind the main dance floor. The flames had burned so hot that melted the mirror ball hanging from the ceiling, turning it into a puddle of glass and silver. Yet the fire hadn't spread beyond that single room. Even stranger, the sprinkler system, which worked perfectly on every other floor, had failed only in the basement. Lieutenant Frank Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the FDNY, would later testify that he'd never seen anything like it. The burn pattern was unusual, concentrated in a perfect circle in the center of the room. It looked less like an accidental electrical fire and more like someone had poured accelerant in a deliberate pattern. And so when Morrison's team found the body, their first thought wasn't that someone had been trapped. It was that someone had been trapped. It was that someone had been placed there. The corpse was positioned directly in the center of the burn pattern, arms crossed over the chest like an Egyptian pharaoh. Even through the severe burns, Morrison could see the victim was wearing what had once been an expensive suit. A melted piece of gold, later identified as a St. Christopher medal, had fused to the chest cavity. The NYPD arrived as dawn broke over Manhattan, and so naturally, in the harsh morning light, the glamorous Studio 54 looked shabby and small. Detective Ray Sullivan from the 18th Precinct took one look at the scene and called for the medical examiner. But within hours, before a proper investigation could begin, word came down from the brass: accidental death, case closed, move on. The official report, filed on February 6, 1980, painted a simple picture. James Castellano, blood alcohol level 0, 18, had passed out drunk in the VIP lounge while smoking. Cigarette ignited the plush velvet sofa. Victim too intoxicated to escape. Tragic accident. Case closed. But Jimmy's girlfriend Diane knew something was wrong with that story. Therefore, she started making noise, calling the precinct daily, demanding answers. Jimmy rarely drank any to stay sharp, he always said. He certainly never drank enough to pass out. And he was fanatical about fire safety, always stubbing out cigarettes completely, never smoking near fabric. What's more, the bartenders at Studio 54 confirmed that Jimmy had been stone sober that night. Tony Martinez, who'd worked the main bar until 3 a.m., swore he'd served Jimmy nothing stronger than club soda with lime. Jimmy never drank when he was working the door, Martinez said, and he was definitely working that night. But despite this evidence, the NYPD refused to reopen the case. But this is where the story takes its darkest turn. But 3 weeks after the fire, Diane received an unmarked envelope slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a single photograph: Jimmy in the Studio 54 basement, talking to two men in expensive suits. One of the men was clearly handing Jimmy a thick manila envelope. On the back of the photo, someone had written, February 3, 11:47 p.m. Diane didn't recognize the men, but she recognized the envelope. It was the same type Jimmy kept in their bedroom, save the ones he'd frantically count and recount during his 4 a.m. pacing sessions. She'd assumed they contained cash, but when she'd finally broken into the safe after his death, she'd found something else entirely. Photographs of license plates, shipping manifests from the port of Newark, and page after page of what looked like coded ledger entries. And so naturally, Diane took everything to the police. Detective Sullivan seemed interested, even excited. He promised to look into it personally. But 48 hours later, Sullivan called with bad news. The evidence had been misplaced in the property room. Every photograph, every document, every coded page gone. Sullivan sounded scared on the phone. "Drop this," he told Diane. "For your own safety, just drop this." But what happened next would make dropping it impossible. Diane couldn't drop it. Therefore, she hired a private investigator, a former NYPD detective named Michael Torino. What happened next changed everything investigators thought they knew about Studio 54. Studio 54's basement, Torino learned, wasn't just a VIP lounge. It was a distribution hub. The disco's famous party favors, mountains of cocaine that magically appeared at celebrity tables, were random gifts from generous patrons. They were samples from a massive trafficking operation that used the nightclub's daily cash flow to launder drug money. And Jimmy, he'd been the bookkeeper, tracking every gram sold, every dollar cleaned. But in January 1980, according to Torino's sources, Jimmy had discovered someone was skimming from the operation, someone very powerful, someone who couldn't afford to be exposed. But the real shock was still to come. The two men in the photograph Diane had found, Torino identified them as Vincent "Vinnie Blue Eyes" Caruso and Thomas Brennan. Caruso was a known associate of the Gambino crime family. Brennan was a detective with the NYPD's organized crime unit. On the night of February 3, 1980, Jimmy Casino made a fatal mistake. He'd arranged to meet Caruso and Brennan in the basement VIP lounge at midnight, after the club closed to the public. Security footage, which mysteriously disappeared from evidence 2 days later, showed Jimmy entering the basement at 11:43 p.m. Caruso and Brennan followed 4 minutes later. According to a witness who came forward 43 years later, Jimmy had given the men an ultimatum: return the missing money, or he'd turn his records over to the FBI. He'd even shown them copies of the ledgers, proving he had names, dates, amounts, everything needed to bring down the entire operation. The meeting lasted exactly 37 minutes. At 12:24 a.m., Caruso and Brennan were seen leaving through the basement exit. Jimmy never left at all. What happened in that room can only be reconstructed from the forensic evidence that survived the fire. The medical examiner's original report, buried for 4 decades, revealed details that never made it into the official story. Jimmy had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of his skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. His wrists showed ligature marks as if he'd been bound. The rope had cut deep into Jimmy's wrists as he struggled against the bindings. Most telling, there was no smoke in his lungs, meaning Jimmy was already dead when the fire started. The basement had gone silent except for the hiss of the accelerant spreading across the floor. The last thing Jimmy saw was Caruso's gold pinky ring glinting in the dim light as the blow came down. The fire itself was a masterpiece of destruction. Accelerant had been poured in a specific pattern designed to destroy evidence while containing the blaze to one room. The sprinkler system hadn't failed, it had been manually disabled. Someone had wanted Jimmy's body found, but only after ensuring no physical evidence survived. They'd even positioned his corpse in that ritualistic pose, arms crossed, like a warning to anyone else who might think about talking. Vincent Caruso died of a heart attack in 1987, taking his secrets to the grave. Detective Thomas Brennan retired with full honors in 1985 and passed away in 2001. Studio 54 closed for good in 1986, its basement sealed and forgotten. And so for 43 years, Jimmy Casino's death remained an accidental tragedy in the official records. His mother Maria went to her grave in 1995, never knowing the truth about her son's death. She kept his photo, the one from his first communion, on her mantel until the day she died. But in March 2023, everything changed. A construction crew renovating the old Studio 54 building discovered a hidden safe behind a false wall in the basement. Inside were Jimmy's original ledgers, the ones everyone thought had been destroyed in the fire. The pages were filled with names, dates, and dollar amounts that corresponded perfectly with known cocaine shipments from Colombia through New York in 1979 and 1980. The NYPD's Cold Case Unit officially reopened Jimmy Casino's case on April 15, 2023. The ledgers revealed a network that reached from Studio 54's dance floor to the highest levels of New York law enforcement and organized crime. Though most of the principals are now dead, the investigation continues. Diane Moretti, now 71 and living in Florida, finally got the answer she'd waited 4 decades to hear. Jimmy Casino didn't die in an accident. He was murdered for trying to do the right thing. And somewhere in the rebuilt basement of what was once Studio 54, his ghost might finally be at rest.